Israel has 200, 300 nuclear missiles, and they can take care of themselves. Why should we commit? We don't even have a treaty with Israel. Why do we have this automatic commitment that we're going to send our kids and send our money endlessly to Israel?
U.S. presidential hopeful Ron Paul speaking there. Now, I'd like to put this next question to Mark Dankoff. Mark, let's look at the relationship now between the U.S. and Israel, specifically when it comes to the issue of the attack and the rhetoric on Iran. Now, first of all, would you agree that Washington is actually having the same stance of Israel, but rather it doesn't want to make it public, it doesn't want to be supporting that publicly? And also, with things like that have been said by Ron Paul, why should the U.S. even team up with Israel?
Well, that's exactly right. I would argue, and I suspect that some of our other guests would argue, that it is not in the true American national interest to be supporting Israel at all. The fact of the matter is that when you look at what they're doing in Iran, it's not an accident that the Washington Post reported just a few days ago that there has been a 5-fold increase in unexplained bomb blasts in Iran just in the last year or the last 2 years. This involves military installations, oil and natural gas sites, and so forth and so on. It becomes very clear, especially when we understand the relationship between the Israeli Mossad and the CIA on the one hand, and the Mujahideen-e-Khalq and the Kurdistani PJAK organization and the Jundala organization operating out of Pakistan in conjunction with the MEK, that there is really a full-fledged undercover war going on against Iran right now in terms of these bomb blasts, in terms of the MEK's assassination of these 3 Iranian nuclear scientists, presumably at the behest of the Israeli Mossad, our continued violation of Iranian airspace with surveillance drones, not to mention all of these economic sanctions, including ones that are now beginning to target Iran's central bank. So the war has actually started. It's just a question of when the wider shooting war begins. And like Dr. Giraldi, I believe that Netanyahu is fully capable of arranging a false flag incident, be that in Israel, be that in Iran, be that in the Persian Gulf, be that in Europe or the United States, that can be pinned on Iran falsely and then will then justify a further escalation in American, Israeli, and British aggression against the Iranian regime. This is a terrifying time, frankly, and in conjunction with the economic problems in the West, it suggests that Benjamin Netanyahu may simply drag Americans by the nose into something that is not in their national interest. Because, again, the power of the Jewish lobby in the United States is unquestioned. If you follow the money trail into these American congressional races, if you look at the amount of Jewish influence that exists in the American news media and in the American educational system, it's clear what's happening here. And I'm afraid the United States is somehow tragically going to become more involved.
Well, something interesting that Mark raised there. Mr. Nashabi, I'd like to put that question to you. He's saying that the war has already started. And, of course, a lot has been said as well about a covert war with Israel and the United States involved already starting on Iran, including a psychological warfare on Iran's nuclear program, including efforts to create a campaign of assassinations, cyber war, as well as a campaign of sabotage. Well, do you think, however, that this is something that will lead up to some kind of airstrike or military attack, or is the war going to stay at this stage because the US and Israel cannot afford to take it into another level?
Well, let's take a look at the variables. First, I just want to say that I agree fully with your guest from San Antonio when it comes to the Israeli lobby and how powerful it is in the United States, and all these speeches are really part of the election campaigns, because you know how influential the Israeli lobby in Israel is and how the effect it can have on the elections. And we've seen that before with Mr. Obama, before he was elected, when he had a long speech at the AIPAC, and also Mrs. Clinton, same thing. Now, I just want to point to 2 examples to add something to what has been said so far. There is let's just not forget that the Americans are just withdrawing from Iraq, and they just suffered a lot in Iraq. So many American boys were actually killed in Iraq. Of course, the American occupation of Iraq was really detrimental also to the American economy. It was, by all standards, it wasn't a successful campaign. And I think, therefore, the time frame is too short. I don't think the Americans would engage in another war against Iran that has a vaster territory, that has more power, that has a solid regime, that has the support of great powers such as, okay, yes, the support is not absolute. There is no absolute support in politics, but there are some common interests with China and Russia that I think this time it's going to be far more difficult to engage in an attack on Iran than when this is a totally different situation than when they invaded Iraq. So
Mr. Giraldi, do you think then that for the United States the option of a military attack is simply out of the question?
Well, the option of a military attack is out of the question if it is the United States that were initiating it. I don't believe that the White House has any interest in starting another war. But as I said before, and Mark Danforth, I think, reinforced, the issue of Israel starting an incident or actually starting a war is a very serious one, because... But
what about the consequences for Israel, Mr. Giraldi? Would Israel afford to do that?
Well, Israel would do it on the assumption that the United States would get involved quickly. And I think that's a valid assumption, and that's why you're seeing all of these statements from Israeli leaders saying that Iran is an imminent threat, we have to do something about it. These statements come every week, and they're coming to convince the American public and the Western public that a war is probably an option that should be looked at. So if Israel were to start it, the media and Congress in the United States would immediately jump on the bandwagon and demand from the White House that the U.S. get involved. I'm convinced of that.
So you're saying, Mr. Giraldi, that the United States would go for that move if it rather understands that Israel has made that decision, that despite all of the consequences that it may have for the United States itself, that it would approve of that move and would get itself involved?
I believe it would get involved, and I cannot see any scenario in which it would not get involved, because the media in the United States would immediately be screaming that our poor little ally Israel is doing the job of attacking the Iranian weapons program, and we have to help them. And Congress would second that call. I cannot see how it would go any other way.
Well, Mark Dankoff, I'd like to put this question to you now, and that's the question of Israel's position in the Middle East. Now, there's been a lot of concern about Israel's nuclear weapons, for instance, and WMD. Ron Paul has been raising that concern also, even for the people in the United States. Now, talking about the nuclear stockpiles of Israel, do you think that this alliance between the U.S. and Israel is starting to turn into a liability rather than an asset for the United States, at least when the people look at it?
This relationship is a liability for the United States in every conceivable way and always has been. It's a liability politically in terms of our standing in the world, not to mention in the Middle East and in Central Asia. It's an absolute economic liability when you look at the billions of dollars that get siphoned out of this country for the Zionist enterprise. It's clearly a liability in terms of the fact that the project for the New American Century crowd and their clean break document of 1996, the so-called strategy for securing the realm, that ideology, which was Israeli-inspired and Israeli-driven, has been totally behind what the United States has now done in both Iraq and in Afghanistan militarily on a surrogate basis. The fact of the matter is that Israel is the tail that wags the American dog. The Zionist-occupied territory that Pat Buchanan has termed the American Congress correctly will continue to be led by Netanyahu, by the congressional nose. He will, if he starts a war with Iran, drag the United States into it because of that dynamic. And it's a great tragedy. And don't forget, we're in an American presidential election year. If the Israelis cannot get what they want out of Barack Obama, they certainly will get what they want out of either Mitt Romney or Newt Gingrich or whatever Israeli-driven neoconservative ends up with the Republican nomination, and Obama knows it.